It always started with a sound, not of thunder, but of engines. Slow at first, almost hesitant, as if the sky itself was deciding whether it wanted to wake. We were far above the ocean then, somewhere south of Kyushu, where the air carried a damp chill and the sea stretched out like an endless sheet of dull metal. The radios crackled with code words, the kind that meant something immense was moving below. And it was. The largest battleship the world had ever built, Japan's last gamble, the Yamato, was heading north, toward a fate even its steel could not bear. For days we had been told about her. A floating fortress, they said. Armour so thick a man could stand inside it and hear the bombs echo like rain on a faraway roof. The Japanese called her the spirit of the empire. To us she was something else entirely, a myth that refused to die, even as the war closed in around her. We didn't hate her. Not really. You couldn't hate a ship like that. You could only respect it and wait for the moment when respect turned into duty. That morning the sea was quiet. Too quiet for April. The air held the heavy scent of oil and salt. The kind of stillness that comes before history moves again. Somewhere out there, Yamato and her small escort, a cruiser and 8 destroyers, were sailing to Okinawa. It was supposed to be a one-way voyage. They knew they didn't have enough fuel to return. The plan was simple. In its madness, reach the beaches, beach the ship, and use her as a fortress until the end. By then, Japan had already lost the ocean. The once mighty Imperial Navy, the fleet that had swept across the Pacific in 1941, was gone, stripped away battle by battle, wave by wave. The sea had turned American blue. Carriers replaced battleships, pilots replaced gunners. The age of giant guns was fading, and Yamato was its final monument, heading to die like a god walking into fire. We launched at dawn, hundreds of planes from Task Force 58, Avengers, Helldivers, Hellcats, rising into the grey, each one heavy with ordnance, each pilot silent inside his own cockpit, engines roaring loud enough to drown out thought. Somewhere below the clouds, a ship the size of a mountain was cutting through the water at 20 knots, heading into oblivion. No one spoke much on those flights. We had seen enough by then, Saipan, later Iwo Jima, to know that victory never looked like what we'd been promised. It was never clean. It never felt final. It was always just another horizon with smoke on it. When we broke through the clouds, the ocean came into view, endless blue speckled with white caps. And then, far off, something massive. Even from altitude, Yamato didn't look like a ship. She looked like a continent trying to hide in the sea. The plume from her funnels trailed like a wound across the morning sky. The radio filled with numbers, bearings, altitudes. No heroics, just precision. That was how war had changed, from charge and glory to calculation and distance. Yet in that distance, there was something almost sacred. You could feel the enormity of it, the weight of centuries ending in the hum of a single propeller. We rolled into formation. The sun caught the wings just right, turning silver to gold for a heartbeat. Below, Yamato's gunners had already seen us. Tiny flashes dotted her deck, the opening lines of the last song she would ever sing. Anti-aircraft fire rose like black rain. Shells burst around us, silent in the thin air, their puffs of smoke forming a crown around the giant below. Even from above she looked beautiful, immense, dignified, doomed. The first wave went in low, torpedo bombers sweeping across the starboard side. Tracer lines cut through the sky like burning threads. I remember seeing one Avenger go down, spinning slowly, wings folding as it kissed the sea. The pilot never bailed. He didn't have time. Our dive came next. The sky became a whirl of smoke, metal, and sound, the kind of chaos that no training could ever make normal. You could feel the ship's guns fighting back, hundreds of them, each blast shaking the ocean like thunder under the waves. Then the bombs began to hit. The first struck near the aft turret, a flash of white fire, then smoke, then silence. Another tore into the forward deck, the explosion rippling through armour so thick it bent but didn't break. And still she moved. Yamato didn't stop. She turned slightly, trying to dodge, trying to fight, as though refusing to accept the death that had already been written for her. It's strange what you remember in moments like that. The shimmer of sunlight on the canopy glass, the reflection of flames dancing across the sea, the smell of cordite and salt, the realization that you're watching something ancient die and you're the one killing it. Torpedoes struck next. One after another, slamming into her port side, water erupted higher than the masts. For a moment she seemed to list, then steady herself, proud even as she bled. You could almost imagine she was alive, a living thing trying to hold on, unwilling to sink beneath the ocean she had ruled. But the sea is patient, it waits for pride to fade. More bombs fell, more torpedoes found their mark. Fires spread across her decks, smoke billowed into the sky, rising so high it could be seen from over 100 miles away. Men ran across the burning steel, tiny figures against an empire collapsing in real time. Then slowly Yamato began to list again, heavier now, more final. Her great guns fell silent. Her hull groaned. The ocean had her now. We circled above, engines low, watching as she rolled. At first it was hard to tell what was happening. Just a gradual tilt, then a sudden, violent motion. The entire ship began to turn, flipping almost upside down. A roar came from within, a sound so deep it felt like the sky shuddered. And then, a flash. The explosion tore her apart. Ammunition magazines ignited, sending a column of fire and debris 3,000 feet into the air. It was like watching a volcano erupt from the sea. For a moment, everything went white. The shockwave rattled our planes even miles away. When the light faded, there was only a boiling patch of ocean and silence. The Yamato was gone. Of the more than 3,000 men aboard, only a few hundred survived. The rest went down with her, swallowed by the same sea they had once believed invincible. We flew home without speaking. There wasn't anything to say. Some victories don't feel like triumphs, they feel like funerals. Back aboard the carriers, word spread quickly. Japan's last battleship had been destroyed. The men cheered at first because that's what you're supposed to do. But the cheers didn't last. They faded into the sound of the wind over the flight deck and the unspoken understanding that something much larger had ended out there. Not just a ship, not just a battle, but an era. For centuries, nations built their power on wood and steel, on the size of their ships and the thunder of their guns. Yamato had been the greatest of them all, the pinnacle of that old faith in armour and range and pride, and yet in the end she never even saw the enemy that killed her. That was the truth of it. Japan had sent a god to sea, and we answered with airplanes. The world had changed, the ocean had changed, and somewhere deep beneath those calm waters, the last breath of an empire was still rising, bubble by bubble, into the endless blue. The sea was quiet again. That's what struck us most. After all the thunder, the black smoke, the rising flame, silence returned faster than we could comprehend. It was as if the ocean itself had swallowed not only the ship, but the sound of it. A storm of steel reduced to ripples. We watched from our returning planes, glancing down at that stillness, trying to understand how something that big could vanish so completely. Somewhere in that grey water were thousands of men who had once believed in the divine. The Imperial Navy had called Yamato the spirit of Japan, the floating embodiment of the nation's soul. To see it gone wasn't just military defeat, it was spiritual extinction. For the Americans, it was the final confirmation of dominance. For Japan, it was the end of a dream. When we landed back on the carriers, we climbed from our cockpits like men waking from a fever. The deck crews cheered, slapping our shoulders, their faces streaked with sweat and salt. But most of us couldn't meet their eyes. We were too tired, too aware of what we'd just witnessed. We had seen the end of something monumental, a king drowning beneath his own crown. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it. This was the day the sea changed sides. Later that evening, as the sun sank over the western horizon, the flight deck went eerily quiet. The air still smelled faintly of oil and cordite. The ship's loudspeakers were playing the low static, a background hum that seemed to echo the emptiness we all carried. I leaned against the railing and looked toward the horizon, thinking about the men we had killed. The sailors, the gunners, the engineers deep inside that massive hull. They weren't faceless enemies anymore. Not after a sight like that. Yamato's crew had fought with everything they had. They'd manned their guns until the sea came for them. No surrender, no retreat. Just an understanding that their country demanded one final gesture of defiance. They had known it was a suicide mission from the moment they left port. The officers had told them that there would be no return. Some had written letters to their families. Others had carried small flags or locks of hair, keepsakes meant for graves they would never see. In the days that followed, reports came in. Fragments of information, survivor testimonies intercepted Japanese communications. It took time to piece it together. Most of the destroyers that had escorted Yamato were gone too, ripped apart by bombs and torpedoes. The survivors spoke of fire everywhere, of deck plating so hot it burned through boots, of men jumping into the sea and vanishing under waves of burning oil. One survivor, pulled from the water by a passing Japanese destroyer before it too sank, said that as Yamato began to roll, the captain stood on the bridge and saluted the rising sun painted on her funnel. The ship's loudspeakers were playing martial music, the Japanese anthem, until the cables snapped and the sound dissolved into the roar of the explosion. It's hard to imagine what that must have felt like to watch the world's greatest warship die beneath your feet. The pride, the terror, the weight of inevitability. They had believed the ship itself was a divine instrument, too sacred to lose. But even gods, it seemed, could drown. Back aboard our carrier, we received confirmation of the victory. Task Force 58 had returned unscathed, save for a few planes lost and a handful of men missing. The contrast was staggering. The Japanese had gambled their last great weapon on a single hopeless charge and lost everything. That night I walked the deck again. The stars were out, sharp and cold, and the sea reflected them like shattered glass. Somewhere below that same ocean lay the twisted remains of a dream, the last heartbeat of an empire that had once believed it could rule the Pacific. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was something quieter, heavier. War has a way of making you forget what's human. You stop thinking about faces and start thinking about silhouettes, ships, formations, targets. The Yamato reminded us what those silhouettes were made of. Each dot on the horizon had lives inside it, men with families, with photographs in their pockets, with voices that would never be heard again. A few days later, we got word of the survivors picked up by Japanese ships. Some of them drifted for hours before being found. Many died from burns or exposure. Others clung to bits of wreckage that still smelled of fuel and smoke. When American reconnaissance planes flew overhead, some waved, too weak to care who saw them. In the end, the sea claimed most of them. The Japanese people didn't learn about Yamato's loss right away. The government kept it quiet, fearing what it would do to morale. But the sailors knew, the families knew. Word always finds its way through the cracks. They began to understand that if Yamato was gone, then so too was any hope of victory. And still Japan fought on. Okinawa burned. Kamikazes fell from the sky. The land war grew crueler by the day. But deep down everyone, American and Japanese alike, knew the end was near. The age of battleships was over. The sea no longer belonged to steel but to the air. Sometimes even now I think about that day. The roar of engines, the flash of explosions, the quiet after. I think about the Japanese sailors who stood on that deck, staring up at the sky as it rained fire. Some must have prayed, others probably cursed. Most, I imagine, just waited. It's strange, I don't remember fear that day. I remember pity, a kind of sorrow that came too late to change anything. Because by the time the bombs fell, we weren't fighting men anymore. We were burying them. After the war ended, a few of us stayed in the Navy, some went home, started families, tried to forget. But the ocean doesn't forget the dumbs. It keeps its ghosts. In 1985, Japanese divers found the wreck of Yamato. She lay upside down in the mud, her guns twisted, her hull broken, the mark of the final explosion still etched into her steel. They said the water was calm there, almost peaceful. The fish swam through the open hatches. Coral had begun to grow across her armour. Nature had reclaimed her, as it always does. One of the divers left a small offering, a folded flag sealed in a glass case. Another bowed before descending. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were standing over the grave of their ancestors, their country's pride, their sorrow. When I saw the footage years later, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt connection. The same sea that carried us to war had carried us home. The same silence that swallowed them had followed us all our lives. That's the thing about history. We think it's about nations and machines, about victories and losses. But in the end, it's about moments like that, the pause after the noise, the stillness after the storm, when you realize that every side thought they were defending something worth dying for. We called her Yamato. They called her Hope, and when she went down, the ocean became a mirror, showing us all what we had become, Sometimes on quiet nights I still hear it. The distant hum of engines over water, the slow heartbeat of the sea. Maybe it's memory, maybe it's guilt, or maybe it's the sound of the last great ship still moving somewhere in the dark, carrying the ghosts of two nations who once met beneath a burning sky. Either way, it always starts the same way, not with thunder, but with steel. Weeks after the battle, when the Pacific finally began to calm, we started to understand what the destruction of that single ship had meant. At first, it felt like just another mission finished. Another objective ticked off the endless list that had carried us from island to island. But the reports kept coming in, from intelligence, from Tokyo Rose broadcasts, from intercepted cables. Japan had no fleet left. The sea, once the Empire's heartbeat, had fallen silent. We had fought Japan's army on land, its planes in the air, its subs below, but it was the death of its navy that broke its spirit. Without the sea, Japan was an island again, cut off from the world it once tried to conquer. In the ready room, someone pinned a newspaper clipping to the wall. It showed an artist's sketch of Yamato sinking, half submerged, flames crawling along her decks. Beneath it, in bold letters, the end of Japan's sea power. Nobody cheered. We just stared at it for a while, each of us realizing that we'd helped erase something colossal. It wasn't joy we felt, it was gravity. At night, the flight deck felt different. The stars hung lower, the air quieter. Planes were still being serviced, bomb racks loaded, engines tested. But the rhythm had changed. The adrenaline that carried us from one battle to the next began to fade. In its place was fatigue, the kind that seeps into the bones and never leaves. I'd walk to the edge of the deck and watch the phosphorescent trail behind the carrier, glowing green in the dark like ghosts rising from the wake. Somewhere under those same waves lay the wreckage of Yamato, her steel cooling in eternal darkness. I used to wonder if the Japanese sailors down there could still hear our engines, the sound of victory circling above their tomb. Radio Tokyo called it a glorious sacrifice. They said the ship had gone down fighting, taking many of our planes with her. It wasn't true, but truth didn't matter anymore. In a war where death had become routine, every side needed meaning to cling to. For Japan, Yamato's end became a symbol of noble futility, proof that their warriors had died as they were meant to. For us, it was a lesson in what power could do when it left humanity behind. Months later, when the war finally ended, I found myself in Tokyo Bay aboard another carrier, anchored near the Missouri where Japan would soon surrender. The harbour was filled with ships, carriers, destroyers, cruisers, a forest of masts and flags stretching to the horizon. The sea that had once belonged to Japan now belonged to everyone and no one. On the morning of the signing, the water was still, almost unnaturally calm. A thin fog rolled across the bay. I remember looking at the shoreline, at the shattered factories and burned districts beyond, and realizing that this was the same nation that had sent Yamato to die. They had believed the sea could save them. In the end, it had only reflected their fall. When the Japanese delegation came aboard the Missouri, there was no defiance left in them, just weariness. As the papers were signed, a breeze swept across the deck and then fluttered the flags. Someone near me whispered, "It's over." But for many of us, it didn't feel that way. You don't end something like that with a signature, you carry it. That night, I stood on deck again and watched the city lights flicker weakly through the haze. I thought about the men who'd gone down with Yamato, about their families waiting for letters that would never come. I thought about the sound of the explosion, the column of smoke that had reached into the sky like a question no one could answer, and I realized that war never really ends. It just changes its shape. In the months that followed, occupation began. Japan transformed faster than anyone thought possible. The shipyards that once built weapons began making cargo vessels, then passenger liners, then cars. The same steel that had been forged for destruction was turned to peace. The sea that had carried soldiers now carried trade. Yet beneath that transformation, the ghosts remained. Every sailor who survived the war carried a map in his mind, not of coastlines, but of memories. Mine was filled with coordinates, places where ships burned, where friends vanished, where the horizon glowed red at night. And somewhere near the southern tip of Kyushu, a small cross marked where the greatest battleship ever built had gone down. I never needed to look it up. I could find it blindfolded. Years later, when I returned to Japan as a visitor, I went to a small museum in Kure. the port where Yamato had been built. The air inside smelled faintly of salt and rust. They had a model of the ship there, enormous, preciate, every gun and rivet recreated. Tourists whispered as they passed it, as if they were in a church. On the wall behind it hung a black and white photograph. The ship at anchor, sunlight glinting off her guns, sailors standing at attention along the deck. They looked impossibly young. A Japanese guide spoke softly to a group of schoolchildren. I couldn't understand all his words, but I caught a few. Pride, sorrow, lesson. The children bowed before moving on. For them, Yamato wasn't a weapon. She was history, a reminder of what their grandparents had endured and what must never happen again. I stayed there long after everyone else had left, staring at that model. For the first time, I saw the ship not as a target, not as an enemy, but as a monument to human will and to human blindness. We had all built our own Yamatos in one way or another. Dreams too heavy to float, beliefs too sacred to question, machines too perfect to doubt. And like the real one, they had all gone down sooner or later. When I stepped outside, the harbour was quiet. Fishing boats bobbed in the distance. The same sea that had devoured empires now lapped gently against the pier. The air was cool, and for a moment I could almost hear the hum of engines fading into memory. War leaves behind strange inheritances. For some, it's medals or scars. For others, it's silence, the kind that fills the spaces between stories. We tell ourselves that ships like Yamato were built for glory, but the truth is simpler. They were built because men believed that size and strength could outlast time. They were wrong. Time is the only ocean that never ends. When I think back now, I don't picture the explosion or the fire. I picture the stillness afterward, the empty sea stretching in every direction, the faint smell of salt and smoke, the realization that something enormous had just slipped beneath the surface of history. We used to believe that victory meant survival, but standing there, decades later, I understood what it really meant. Remembering. Remembering so that the next generation wouldn't need their own Yamato to learn what the last one had already paid for. The Japanese have a word, mugen, endless, without limit. That's what the sea is. That's what memory becomes. Somewhere out there, under 300 feet of quiet water, a ship still sleeps. And when the tide turns just right, and the sun hits the waves at a certain angle, you can almost see her outline, the last shadow of an age when men thought steel could save them. We were there when that shadow disappeared, and for the rest of our lives we carried its reflection. After Yamato was gone, the ocean no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a graveyard that refused to close. By the summer of 1945, our carriers roamed without challenge. The horizon was ours, yet every new sunrise carried a weight none of us could name. We had taken the Pacific, but the victory felt hollow. Every island we passed looked like a scar. Black sand, twisted palms, beaches where silence had replaced the surf. The air still smelled of smoke even weeks after the gun stopped. We flew missions against Japan itself now, cities, shipyards, railways, anything that still moved. From the cockpit, the mainland looked smaller than we'd imagined, but heavier somehow, as if it carried centuries of memory beneath its mountains. We could see the rice fields shining like mirrors, the rivers cutting through the plains, the faint trails of smoke where villages still lived. And then came the fires. The new missions weren't like Midway or Leyte. They were something else entirely. The B-29s flew at night, black shapes gliding above the clouds, and when they dropped their loads, the sky beneath them turned orange. We could see it from hundreds of miles away, a glow that pulsed on the horizon like a heartbeat. Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, each one burning until its light reached the edge of the sea. I remember standing on deck, watching the sky over Japan flicker. It didn't look like war anymore. It looked like the end of the world. Some of the younger pilots cheered when the reports came in. Factories destroyed, arsenals flattened, thousands of buildings gone. They said this would shorten the war, that every flame tonight was one less battle tomorrow. But the older ones just stared. They'd seen too much to believe that destruction ever truly ended anything. We had begun with ships and sailors and ended with cities and civilians. The ocean that once divided armies had become irrelevant. The war had risen into the air, and we were the ones carrying it. When news of the atomic bomb reached us, we didn't understand at first. We thought it was just another exaggeration. One more miracle weapon like the ones we'd heard about for years. But then the photographs arrived. Hiroshima. A single flash, and a city erased. There are moments in history when the human mind can't decide whether it's witnessing triumph or tragedy. That was one of them. We'd spent 4 years building machines that could dominate the sea, and now we had built one that could end the world. The same week Nagasaki followed. The radio transmissions from Japan fell silent. For 2 days, nothing. Then came the message: unconditional surrender. On the deck of our carrier, the crew gathered around the loudspeakers as the announcement played. No cheers this time, just a long collective exhale, the kind of sound a man makes when he finally puts down something he's carried too long. Someone said softly, "Yamato died for nothing." Another answered, "No. She died so we'd know what nothing looks like." In the weeks that followed, we anchored off Japan's coast and waited. The mountains looked peaceful from the sea, mist rolling down their slopes, villages quiet under the morning sun. It was hard to imagine that this place had once commanded the most feared navy on Earth. A few of us took small boats ashore under orders to inspect the ports. What we found were ghosts, harbours full of half-sunken hulls, docks splintered by bomb strikes, cranes rusted into strange, twisted shapes. In Yokosuka, a destroyer lay on its side, her deck covered in gulls. The air smelled of rust and seaweed. I stepped aboard, one wreck, a cruiser maybe. The markings were gone. Inside, the corridors were filled with water up to the knees. Papers floated like jellyfish in the dim light. A photograph clung to a bulkhead, a family smiling. The edges were burned, but the faces were still there. That's when it hit me. We had fought a nation, but we'd also fought people who weren't so different from us. They'd loved, believed, and bled for something that vanished in smoke. Back on the carrier that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of the wrecks beneath us, the iron bones of Japan's empire stretching across the seabed. Somewhere among them lay the Yamato, her guns pointing toward nothing, her decks blanketed in silt. The ocean had taken her pride and turned it into quiet. The Japanese sailors who survived told their own stories later. Some said the sea around Yamato glowed for hours after she exploded, lit by burning fuel and phosphorus. Others swore they heard her engines still rumbling beneath the waves as they drifted on the debris. One man said he saw the captain's flag flutter underwater, trapped against the overturned hull like a trapped soul. They called her the Spirit of Japan. Maybe they were right, because even after she died, Japan's spirit changed, but never disappeared. Out of the ashes rose something new, not the empire that had fallen, but a nation that learned humility the way steel learns pressure, by nearly breaking. For us Americans, the war's end felt both infinite and unfinished. We had won everything, yet we'd lost something invisible along the way. That sense of certainty that victory meant righteousness. Standing there in Tokyo Bay, watching the sun rise over a quiet sea, I realized that we had entered a new age. One where power no longer came from ships or guns, but from the knowledge of what we were capable of. The battleship era had ended with Yamato. The atomic age had begun with a whisper of wind over a city's ashes. One era sank into the sea, the other fell from the sky. When I think about it now, I don't separate them. They're the same story. The last breath of the old world and the first gasp of the new. Yamato went down believing in armor. Hiroshima went down proving that armor was meaningless. The ocean still moves the same way it did then. It hides the bones, erases the trails, and pretends nothing ever happened. But every sailor who's looked into that deep knows better. The sea remembers. It remembers the smoke, the fear, the promise that men made to themselves when they built something too powerful to control. Sometimes I imagine the wreck lying there, surrounded by silence. Fish drifting through her hallways, coral climbing her decks, the sea slowly forgiving what we couldn't. Above her, ships still pass, their engines humming through the deep like distant prayers. The war ended. The world moved on, but the ocean keeps its ghosts. Years later, when peace had settled so deeply over the Pacific that the younger sailors could scarcely believe it had ever been otherwise, I found myself standing again at the edge of that same sea. The air smelled of salt and fuel just as it always had, but the sounds were different. No engines, no sirens, no gun crews shouting over the wind, just the steady sigh of waves against the pier and the distant bell of a buoy swaying somewhere beyond the harbour mouth. I was an old man by then, the uniform no longer fit, and the medals felt like souvenirs from another life. But the sea hadn't changed. It never does. It still looked endless, still carried that strange mixture of peace and menace that had followed me since I first set foot on a deck. I'd returned as part of a delegation, veterans from both sides. The Japanese had invited us for a memorial, not of victory or defeat, but remembrance. They held it near Kure, where Yamato had been built. The docks were quiet, the cranes rusted but still standing, like old soldiers who refused to fall. The ceremony was simple. No speeches of triumph, no flags raised high, just prayers, soft and deliberate, drifting into the wind. A few of the Japanese veterans wore their old caps, the white faded to ivory, the gold insignia dulled by time. One of them approached me after the ceremony, his back bent but his eyes clear. He introduced himself in slow English. "I was on Musashi," he said, the sister ship of Yamato, sunk months before. We shook hands. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he pointed out toward the bay and said, almost to himself, "The sea is gentle now." I nodded. "It remembers everything," I said. He smiled faintly. "So do we." That was the closest we came to forgiveness, not through words, but through the silence that follows when both sides have run out of anger. That evening I walked down to the water alone. The sun was setting, throwing bands of red and gold across the bay. The colours looked almost too familiar, like the reflection of fire from a skylong gale. For a moment I thought of the men trapped inside Yamato, of the faces I never saw, the voices I never heard. Then I thought of our own crewmen lost to storms, accidents and exhaustion, the quiet casualties no one remembers. It struck me how small we all were, how the ocean dwarfed every ship, every nation, every dream of empire. We'd fought to command it, but in truth no one ever commands the sea. It allows us to cross, to live, to fight, and then, when it's done with us, it erases the wake as if we were never there. As twilight deepened, I saw lanterns appearing on the shore. The Japanese families were setting them afloat, paper boats with candles inside, drifting gently toward the open water. Each one carried a name, a wish, a fragment of memory. I asked if I could light one too. They nodded. I wrote a name I hadn't spoken in decades. Sam Whitaker, my gunner. He'd gone down in a training crash a week before the war ended. No medals, no headlines, just gone. I set the lantern on the surface and watched it drift among the others. The tide carried them slowly outward, a constellation of flickering lights mirrored by the stars above. For a while I couldn't tell where the sky ended and the ocean began, and I thought, maybe that's the point. Maybe memory and water are the same thing, always moving, never holding still, carrying fragments of everything they've touched. Somewhere far beyond the horizon lay Yamato, and above her, the same stars that watched her die still burned without interruption. Time had passed, but the sea hadn't forgotten. When I finally turned to leave, a young Japanese boy standing nearby asked through an interpreter, "Why do Americans come to our memorial?" I paused. "Because we remember the same sea," I said, "and the same silence." He seemed to think about that, then bowed politely and ran off to help his family gather more lanterns. I walked back through the narrow streets of Kure, where small restaurants now lined the waterfront, where laughter replaced the echo of shipyard hammers. The smell of grilled fish and soy drifted through the air. Life had returned. The empire was gone, but the people remained. Gentler now, quieter, wiser. War has a strange way of teaching peace. The men who survived it often become its most faithful disciples, not because they learned the beauty of peace, but because they learned the emptiness of war. When I boarded the plane home, I looked out the window one last time. The bay shimmered under the moonlight, perfectly still. I tried to imagine the shape of the wreck below, resting in the silt, her great guns pointing into darkness. I wondered if the fish still swam through the corridors, if coral had grown thick across the decks, if perhaps, in some way, she was finally at rest. The engines roared to life and the plane began to climb. The sea fell away beneath us, shrinking into silver lines. I pressed my hand against the glass, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement. For everything it had taken, the ocean had also given me something, an understanding that all power fades, but memory endures. As the clouds closed below, I thought of that first moment years ago. The flash, the roar, the sudden stillness. And I realized that even then, as the Yamato sank, we were witnessing not just an ending, but the beginning of something else. The moment humanity learned that victory without compassion is just another kind of loss. The world moved on, the sea kept breathing, and somewhere in the deep a ship still dreams beneath the weight of water, her story carried not by nations or monuments, but by the quiet hearts of those who remember. We once believed the sea was ours to conquer, but in the end it conquered us, and that, I think, is how history stays alive, not through the noise of guns, but through the silence that follows them. There comes a point in every sailor's life when the sound of the sea replaces the sound of engines. You can hear it even when you're miles inland, the faint rhythm of waves striking memory, the echo of something that refuses to fade. For me, it began long after the war ended, when I realized that everything we'd built, everything we'd destroyed, had returned to the same silence we'd started from. I sometimes sit by the shore now, far from any harbour, and watch the tide pull in slow breaths against the sand. Children run along the waterline, their laughter scattered by the wind. Their world is lighter, freer, untouched by the things that haunted ours. That's how it should be. The sea has forgiven them, even if it hasn't forgiven us. Every now and then, I'll see a ship on the horizon. The new ones look like cities, grey towers gliding across the water, their decks lined with radar and antennae instead of guns. I think about how we once measured strength in inches of armour, in calibers of steel. Now it's measured in signals and silence. The technology changed, but the lesson remains. No machine, no nation, no dream is unsinkable. When I close my eyes, I still see the Yamato. Not the explosion, not the smoke, but her first appearance through the clouds that morning. The sheer immensity of her. The impossible dignity. For a moment, even in the middle of war, we were awed. She wasn't just an enemy target, she was the last monument to a way of believing in war that the world was about to outgrow. Sometimes I wonder what the Japanese sailors thought in those final minutes, when the bombs fell and the sea climbed up to meet them. Did they curse us? Did they pray? Did they look toward their homeland or into the fire? Or did they simply close their eyes and listen to the water rushing in? We'll never know. But I like to think that, in the end, the sea took them gently. Years ago, a historian asked me if I believed the war was necessary. I told him I believed it was inevitable, which is not the same thing. He asked if I felt proud of what we'd done. I said yes and no. Pride fades quickly when it's weighed against memory. What lasts isn't the victory, but the understanding that we were part of something larger than ourselves, something that cost more than anyone could afford. I once read that the Japanese named their battleship Yamato, after an ancient word meaning great harmony. I don't think they realized how prophetic that was. Her destruction, our triumph, the long years that followed, all of it was part of that same search for balance. Two nations driven by fear and pride met on an endless sea, and when the fires died, both had to learn how to live in the quiet together. After the war, when trade replaced torpedoes and the Pacific filled with merchant ships instead of convoys, some of us wondered whether the ocean had forgiven us. Maybe it had. The sea is patient. It outlives empires. It carries the same rhythm long after the names have faded. I sometimes imagine the Yamato lying there still, not as wreckage, but as a reef, a home for fish, a mountain of iron turned to coral, life growing over the instruments of death. Maybe that's how the world heals. Slowly, quietly, without asking permission. I've been asked why I tell this story so often, why I return to it when so many others have tried to forget. The answer is simple. Because forgetting would mean the sea sank for nothing. Because those men, ours and theirs, deserve more than silence without remembrance. When you spend enough time on the water, you learn that silence isn't empty. It's full of echoes, waiting for someone to listen. And so, when the wind is right and the waves are calm, I listen. I hear the hum of engines somewhere beneath the surface, the echo of guns that haven't fired in decades, the faint murmur of voices calling through time. They remind me that history isn't a collection of victories, it's a collection of lessons written in salt and blood. We called her the enemy once. Now she's just part of the ocean, as we all are in the end. The last time Japan went to sea, it went with pride and despair in equal measure. We met them with fire and distance. And when it was over, the world learned something both terrible and tender, that even the mightiest fall quietly when the sea decides it's time. The tide is coming in now. The sky above me is turning the same deep colour it was on that April morning so many years ago. I can feel the cool spray on my hands, hear the slow roll of waves against stone. Somewhere far away, the wreck of a giant sleeps beneath this same water, her name whispered by the current, her story carried by every swell that touches the shore. And as the light fades, I realise the war never truly left the sea. It just became its reflection. It always starts with a sound, not of thunder, but of steel. And then, like everything else, it ends in silence,